We're studying Daf Nun Hey Amid Beis, and we said that according to Rabbi Yehuda, the halacha is that the dam hapar and the dam hasor are each put into a different kan, a different vessel, and Rabbi Yehuda is concerned about not mixing one from the with the other, meaning when the Kohen Gadol is finished with the hazos lifnai v'lifnim, now he's ready for the hazos on the parochs of the heichal outside the Kodesh Kodashim. He's finished his hazos with the dam apar. Whatever dam is left in the receptacle, in the klisharis, has to be placed on its own base, as opposed to the dam hasor, which has its own base. So there shouldn't be a confusion, because he's got to now move forward after the hazos in the heichal of the dam hapar. Now he has to go to the dam hasor. So the Gemara asks, what about the possibility of avoiding any mistake by nichtov alayu? That was the Gemara at the end of Nun Hey Amid Aleph. Let's just write on each kan exactly where it should go and where it should not go. And the Gemara says, Lesle Ksiva. Rabbi Yehuda holds that we don't rely on just simply labeling, writing it on the outside. The reason for this is because some people on certain occasions may not pay attention to what it says on the outside, so we don't rely, according to Rabbi Yehuda, on Ksiva. Disnan, and the Gemara now brings our Mishnah to prove this point. Disnan, we learned in the Mishnah, he finishes the hazos of the dam hasor inside the Kodesh Kodashim. He's now about to implement the hazos of the par on the paroches out in the heichal, and according to the Tanakama, he places the mizrach of the dam hasor on the same kan. On a different kan, on a second kan in the heichal. But Rabbi Yehuda Omer lo hayasham ela kan echad bilvad. There was only one. Only one base, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, first he placed the mizrach with the dam hapar on that kan. Then afterwards, when he finished, he would then place the mizrach with the dam hasor on that very same kan, and remove the kan with the dam hapar in it. Trey my time low. Why is it that Rabbi Yehuda insists there's only one kan against the Tanakam who has two? Mishum de michlafe. We're always afraid that maybe perhaps there would be some sort of mistake, and he would exchange mistakenly the two mizrakos on these two kanim. Because again, if he puts the mizrak of the dam hapar on one kan and the dam hasor on another kan, we might, heaven forbid, get to a situation where he'll take the dam hapar to be maz on the paroches. Instead, when he's about to take the dam hapar, he goes to the other kan and he mistakenly takes the dam of the soyer. And we have to first do the hazot. The seder here is critical. First the par and then the soyer. If there's only one kan, then such a mistake would be totally avoided, because he wouldn't be able to put down one kan. I say it the other way around. He wouldn't be able to take away one kan until he first puts down the other kan. So there'll be a removal of the kan, let's say, for example, the kan ha-soyer, and then the mizrak on the kan hasor, and then once he empties that base, then he can put down the mizrak of the dam hapar. Gemara asks, "V'navitrei v'litov alayu hai depar v'hai desor." Why doesn't Rabbi Yehuda rely, even if we have a kan for the sor, a separate kan for the par, just simply write on it? And the answer is, El Rabbi Yehuda less like ksiva. He doesn't want to rely on ksiva. Is it really true that Rabbi Yehuda does not rely on ksiva? What about the Mishnah in the sixth parak of Shkolim? Shloshes shofaros. We'll read the Mishnah, and then the Gemara is going to take apart the Mishnah piece by piece. there are 13 shofaros. Like the shofar is wide on the bottom and narrow on the top so that no one could, illegally put his hand inside. Anyway, there are 13 such shofaros that kept the monies for the various karbonos and the nedavos. And vayakasav alehem, on one of the shofros, it said, taklin chadatin. We'll see what that means in a second. On another one, it said taklin ikin. There was another shofar that had written on it kinim, and another one that had gozle ola. Then we had a shofar that said eitzim. That was for the people who donated money to buy logs for the marach on the mizbeach. Then, of course, we have a shofar for lavona. So if a person comes forward with a contribution, a voluntary contribution for lavona, the monies for the lavona are put in that shofar, and then they buy the lavona and the maktir on the mizbeach. Then we have another shofar that says on it zahav lichpores, a person who contributed, pledged to bring a gold, and he puts his motes into that khan. And that was used, that money was earmarked to buy clay shards. Then there were 6 shofros that each one of them had the word nedava written on it, lenedava, and that's called olas kates hamizbeach. If the mizbeach, an event, is not being used, it's free for a certain time during the daylight hours, then they would take the monies from these different shofros, which were earmarked for nedava, and they would bring voluntary karbonos on the mizbeach. They also put the damim monies of motzar hashamos v'chatos. Now the Gemara goes through each one of these categories in the Mishnah and Shkolim, and then we'll see how this presents a problem for our understanding of Yehuda, who rejects ksiva. We begin with taklin chadatin. Elu shkolim shel kol hashana shel kol shana v'shana. These are the annual contributions of the Machzah Shekel. Normally, they would be collected during the month of Adar, but there are 3 periods of time before each of the regalim when they would be collected. So these are this year's taklin chadatin, this year's contribution of shkolim, taklin shkolim, and those are given into the Trumas HaLishka and earmarked for Karbonos Tzibur for that year. Then we have another shofar. It's written taklin atikin. What does that mean? Old, ancient taklin. Mishal shakal eshtaked. If the year went by and he didn't bring his machzah shekel, yishkol l'shana ba, he now will replace his shkolim for next year. And again, this went into the shiari al-lishka. These are the most that were left in the lishka after all the Trumas HaLishka monies were used during the course of the year. And once again, these monies were earmarked for the tzibur, not for karbanos, but rather for tzarchei hatzibur. For example, binyan choma seir, building the walls around the city, migdal seha, or the towers. Then we have a shofar that says on a kinim. And what is kinim? Hein torin. This was designated for someone who pledged on a voluntary basis, or either a neder or a nedava, torim. And the monies for those torim that were contributed on, as we said, a voluntary basis, were placed into a shofar upon which it was written torim. And then gozle ola. There's another shofar when they inscribed gozle ola, and what gozel usually means a young bird, and in this case, hein b'nei Yona, these are doves, young doves, which were designated for someone, monies that were designated for someone who volunteered and pledged to bring b'nei Yona. and the monies were put into this particular shofar for Bnei Yona. And the reason why it's called Gozle Yom is based on a pasuk in Bereshis, Vitarva Gozal. A Gozal is a young bird. And we see this in the brachos at the end of Chumash, in Vizos HaBracha, Al Gozalav Yerachef. And Torim are Dafka Gdolim, Bnei Yona Dafka Ketanim. And Vikulan Olos. And all these shofros that we discussed are Olos. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda holds that these shofros were for Kinei Nidava, for optional voluntary contributions of Olos, and they were designated exclusively for Olos. Now, in the case of Kinei Chova, for example, a Zav, a Zova, a Yoledes, etc., they bring Shtei Torim, Shnei B'nei Yonah, but one is a Korban Chatas, the other is a Korban Ola. These monies were not put into a shofar, but rather they were given straight into the hands of the Kohen, who would then purchase Shtei Torim, Shnei B'nei Yonah, designate one for Chatas and the other for Ola. And we'll see in a minute why Rabbi Yehuda excludes Kinei Chova. In other words, this whole process of designating shofros for Kinei Chova is only according to the Chachamim. Rabbi Yehuda rejects it. Chachamim hold in the 6th parak of Shkolim that the shofar that says upon it, written on it, Kinim, they would put the money of Kinei Chova, and they would take that money and bring one Chatas and one Ola. There's another shofar upon which it was inscribed Gozle Ola, and that's where they put the monies for Kinei Nidava, for voluntary contributions. Again, all of which were for Ola. In any event, we see clearly from this Mishnah that Rabbi Yehuda accepts Ksiva, because the Mishnah quoting Rabbi Yehuda says, Vayakasuv Aleim. That's explicit, right? Shofars B'migdash, Vayakasuv Aleim, right? And we have one that's inscribed for Taklin Chadati, the other for Taklin Atikin, etc., etc. But we see that Rabbi Yehuda is relying on Ksiva. So why is it that Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah says that we don't rely on Ksiva, and therefore we need a separate Khan for the Mizrach that holds the Dama Par, and another one for the Mizrach that holds the Dama Soyer. In addition, in the Mishnah in Shkolim, why is it that Rabbi Yehuda denies designating a shofar for Kinei Chova? He only accepts designating a shofar, putting money into a shofar for the purpose of Kinei Nidava. So you're going to tell me, well, maybe he's going to mix up the two. Well, why not just say these monies in this shofar are designated for Kinei Chova, and these in the other shofar, let's inscribe on it, dedicated for Kinei Nidava. And you see that Rabbi Yehuda accepts the concept of Ksiva. That's how he designated various shofars for various monies for purposes. So Kiyos Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel Omar, Amri b'Marov in Eretz Yisrael, they gave an explanation for Rabbi Yehuda. Why would there no shofaros for Kinei Chova, only for Kinei Nidava? And the answer is Gzeira Mishum Chata Shemesu Ba'alecha. If a person were to leave money designated for a chova and then he dies, so let's say, for example, we have monies that are in a shofar that are designated for a chatas shel chova. Now, once the owner, the bailim of this karma, the monies that are meant to buy a karma, dies, then we're not allowed to have any benefit whatsoever from those monies. We have to As it says in Nazir Daf Chaf Daled, we have to be molech them liyam hamelech. We have to take those monies and throw them into the Dead Sea. Again, there's a long discussion in Rishon about whether or not Dinam Lamisa has the same status as Katas Payment. It's included in the Halacha Moshe Sinai of Mesu Bailam Lamisa, which is a sugya in Masechet Mura Daf Yud Zayin Amid Beis. And it seems that according to both Rashi and Tosfos Halacha, we paskin that Halacha Mesu Balel Lamisa applies even to a Chatas Ha'of. There seems to be some contradiction from a different Rashi in Masechet Nazir about this very same point. In any event, since we have here, in the case of Mesu Balel, we have mos in this shofar that are betarovos. Tarovos means we have now a mixture of mos, right? We have mos that are completely psulos, and we have mos that theoretically are ksheros, right? The mos that were designated lechova by the Bailam and the Bailam died, those are mos psulos. But the rest, the balance of the mos in that same shofar are mos ksheros, theoretically. But because of the taroves, we're going to have to establish that all the mos in that shofar are psulos. So therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says, you know what? We're not going to designate any shofaros for kinei chova because of this passash that the bailim of the korah might die, and therefore there's going to be a mixture, a taroves with chatash mesu balel. So the Gemara raises the following objection on Rav Dimi's explanation of the meaning and the underlying reasoning of Rabbi Yehuda because of a suffix chatash mesu balel vichai shinon vasnan. We have a Mishnah Masechet Gittin hasholech chataso mimedinas hayam. A person is far away from the Beis Hamikdash. He appoints a proxy, and he sends a korban chatas from far away, Medina Sayyam, through this proxy, the shliach, to be makrivit in the Beis Hamikdash. Makrivin otsa b'chezkas shu kayam. We're not being afraid that maybe he died and the chatas is a chatas shemesu balel shadina lemisa. So you see that we're not worried about such a thing. So therefore, why should we, according to Rabbi Yehuda, here in the case of Kinei Chova, why should we be choshesh that that maybe Mesu Balel, and the Gemara therefore says Ella Mishum Chatos Shemesu Balel Vada. It's not that we're afraid that maybe after this person designated his mos for a chatos, he died. We don't have to be choshesh that he'll die. But rather, what happens in a case where we know he died? That's what we're worried about. Because in a case we know he died, then we have this taroves of mos psulos together with mos ksheros in this one shofar. So the Gemara asks, v'nivar arba zuzi. Why don't we just take out 4 zuzim from the shofar and designate them as the domim for that chatos of Mesu Balel? V'nishtei b'maya, we'll take it out to the Yam HaMelach and we'll throw it into the Yam HaMelach. Now we have a clarity, we've clarified which domim, which mos in this tarovis are psulos. We've now, because they were unspecified, and now they're specified. V'hanach nishtaru, and whatever's left in the shofar certainly can be used for the korbanos. The Gemara answers Rabbi Yehuda Leslie Ver. This option of now choosing 4 mos, 4 zuzim, and designate them as the mos for that particular chova of the person who never died, that's based on the sugya of brera. And in fact, Rabbi Yehuda holds that we don't rely on brera. me Nolan. Can you tell me where's the source upon which you can base your conclusion that Rabbi Yehuda rejects Brera? Elam, if you're going to tell me this not. Actually, I'm not sure if this is a Mishnah. Tosus actually says Hadisanya. It's a brisa. Halokeach, somebody purchased Yayin Mibena Kusim Kusim, were those individuals, that nation that was brought by Sancheiriv Melech. He was Moshev Kusim Bi'ore Shomron. This is a whole parsha in Malachim Beis Perek Yud Zayin, and they came from an area called Kusa, and that's why they were called Kusim. They, so to speak, converted because they were afraid of the lions. In any event, there's machlokus and kedushin on Daf Ayin Heim and Beis, what the status of the Kusim is whether the gerus is considered a valid gerus, or it's not valid. They were not motivated really to be miskayir. It was geri arayos with an aleph. And now you purchased yayin from the kusim. They're not mafresh chumas and maestros. And it was erev Shabbos Simchat Shech. It was the last moment. And the problem is that as he's going into Shabbos, he doesn't have a utensil to be mafresh from this yayin into another utensil and designate that as truma and maisa. So the brisa suggests that Omed vi Omer, he can stand and declare Shnei Lugim, 2 Lugim from the 100. Now it doesn't say explicitly 100, but we know that Mida Beinanis, the average person, when he gives truma, he will be mafresh 2% of his, in this case, yayin for truma. So 2 out of 100 is 2%. And shadi osid lahafresh, and he's declaring now in erev Shabbos, in the future I'll be mafresh. Right now I'm not designating it. I don't have the kelim for that. Harei hein truma. They could be truma, and it's going to be a valid truma. And here on the top of Nun Vav Amud Aleph, Asara Maser Rishon and Tisha Maser Shin. This is all the shita of Rabbi Meir, Meichal, Shosei Biyad Divrei Rabbi Meir.